My family owns a small cabin on the outskirts of a quiet town in North Carolina, an old place that holds many memories within its walls. This cabin, considered a family heirloom, has a special value in our hearts. We are all hesitant to part with it, not only because it represents our family history, but also because it carries a captivating story linked to it. A story that might intrigue any neutral observer, but was undoubtedly terrifying for my grandmother, who lived through that experience. It was the summer of 1988, a year before I was born. At that time, my grandmother spent her days in the cabin alone, as my grandfather had passed away before I was born. However, they used to visit this place together every summer. My grandparents would use this cabin as a retreat from the hustle and bustle of urban life, spending 2 whole weeks away from everything, with only the squirrels as their companions. But after my grandfather's death, my grandmother decided to keep this tradition alive and continued going there alone as a way to cope with her grief. In June 1988, my grandmother set off for the cabin by herself for the first time. Without a companion, there was no television, but she had an old radio to listen to a station that was my grandfather's favorite. The station, like most of its kind, interspersed short news segments, and one day, my grandmother heard reports of a series of terrorist bombings occurring in Georgia and Alabama, resulting in many injuries. The police had already identified a suspect they wanted to question, but the man had gone into hiding, with suspicions that he was hiding in the hills of North Carolina. The reporter describing the suspect painted a picture of a dangerous individual. He was of average height, with dark hair and light eyes, and the man's name was Klaus Belmont. My grandmother couldn't forget this name. It resonated with her memories of a Christmas song about Santa Claus, and even though singing it in midsummer was considered bad luck, she found herself whistling the tune around the cabin. Hours passed as she enjoyed country songs and one of her favorite romantic shows, and she began to forget the news of the bombings. As the sun set, while she was relaxing and reading a book on the old couch that still resides in the cabin, she heard a knock on the door. This struck her as very odd since she wasn't expecting any visitors. Her only neighbors lived nearly a mile away. A sense of fear gripped her, but she rose and walked to the front door. Upon opening it, she found a man of average height, with light eyes, a dark mustache, and a striking cowboy hat. Being a kind-hearted soul, she welcomed him and said, "Good evening," asking how she could assist him. The man began, "Good evening, ma'am. I apologize for bothering you, but I have a small request." He asked if she had any food to spare, explaining that he also owned a cabin in the area, but had forgotten to bring food along. Leaving him without anything to eat for him, he asked if she had any food to spare, explaining that he also owned a cabin in the area, but had forgotten to bring food along, leaving him without anything to eat for the night. My grandmother sensed something was off. The man seemed too cunning. Despite her reservations, she invited him inside. Of course, my grandmother kept a pantry stocked with all sorts of canned and dried foods, so she filled the man's backpack with supplies. However, in a moment of hesitation, she lifted her gaze and asked for his name. Her instinct kicked in when he told her his name was Claire. When she asked for his last name, for an inexplicable reason, he revealed his real last name, Belmont. This last name triggered alarm bells in her mind, and while she wasn't entirely sure why, it was enough to make her stomach drop. In a time before cell phones, and with no landline in the cabin, her only means of communicating with the outside world was shouting, something that would hardly reach anyone a mile away. My grandmother recalled that at that moment, fear began to creep in. Realizing she had no real way to defend herself beyond an old flare gun, she understood that if the situation was as dire as she suspected, the flare gun wouldn't suffice against a stranger. Instead, she decided to play it cool and navigate the situation carefully. She thought that if she acted foolishly and offered him more food, allowing him to stay, he might not become aggressive. If she was lucky enough to survive the night, she could drive to town in the morning and inform the police that the man they were looking for had stopped by the cabin. Just as she was about to politely ask him to leave, he said something that changed everything and sent chills down her spine. "Actually, I have one more small request. Is there a place in this cabin where I could rest and sleep for the night?" My grandmother recalls that there was a tense silence as she looked at the man face to face, seeing a mix of desperation and malice in his eyes. Trying to remain calm, she said, "I'm sorry, but I don't have a spare room." In response, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a gun, and said, "I'm so sorry. I was hoping you wouldn't say that." He then pointed to the gun and added, "Don't make me use this." For anyone still oblivious, the man at her door was not Claire Belmont or any fake name he concocted. He was Klaus Belmont himself, the terrorist responsible for many deaths. My grandmother stated that this was undoubtedly the most terrifying moment of her life, but not for the reasons one might assume. She was not afraid of dying at the hands of this man. At around 70 years old at that time, she believed she had already settled her affairs with God long ago. What truly frightened her was the normality of this strange man. Even after he removed his mask and revealed his true face, he remained polite and friendly toward her, even offering to help with chores in the morning. Naturally, she told him that she could manage just fine on her own, and certainly didn't want the FBI to think she was consenting to his stay. But he didn't seem like the crazy person she had imagined. After hearing the news report, my grandmother noted that the only time he truly revealed a glimpse of who he was, or what he had done, was when they said grace before dinner. She couldn't recall his exact words, but it was something like, "In the end, the righteous will prevail." Here was a man who had literally killed hundreds of people and attempted to kill hundreds more in a series of horrific bombings. So, she simply couldn't process the reality that he was referring to himself as one of the righteous, which horrified her more than many things in the world had up until that night. My grandmother felt as if she was face to face with a flesh and blood devil, and just the thought of sharing a table with him made her stomach churn, so it was no surprise that she barely touched her food. After dinner, she retreated to her bedroom while Klaus took the old couch. Lying in her room, she couldn't close her eyes, anticipating an explosion at any moment that could shatter her life. As midnight approached, she began to hear the sound of helicopters, and suddenly, the entire cabin was illuminated. A bright white light shone down, and then she realized it was a helicopter. At that moment, she thought it was only a matter of moments before a team of FBI agents would storm the cabin, but she didn't want to leave her room. She waited for several moments as the sound of the helicopter roared overhead, but no one entered the house. Instead, at some point, the helicopter simply flew away. She must have dozed off eventually because the next time she awoke, The cabin was fully lit, but this time not by helicopter lights, but by the morning sun. She got up and wandered around the cabin, but there was no sign of Klaus, as if all of it had been part of a dream, as if he had never truly existed. But then she found a handwritten note on the table that read, "Thank you for your hospitality. God bless you." There was no doubt in her mind that it had all been real, and that the helicopter she saw that night had indeed come for him. My grandmother would later express that if she had been a young woman, he might have truly harmed her. But being an elderly woman, she posed no real threat to him. Moreover, she knew very well that the little cabin had no phone line or any means to report an intruder to anyone. Yet my grandmother always emphasized that what was truly frightening about this experience wasn't that he could have harmed her, as her intuition somehow told her he wouldn't, but that this man was entirely normal and polite. There was no difference between him and anyone else we might consider harmless and decent. This was likely one of the most important lessons my grandmother left us through this experience. Sometimes the real monsters aren't terrifying creatures that emanate evil upon being looked at. In some cases, they could be, but often, the most vile and wicked monsters hide behind a harmless facade and polite demeanor. Thus, we should not trust someone solely based on their appearance. My name is Adele, and the story I'm about to tell you happened when I was 15 years old. At that time, I was living in a very remote town with a population of fewer than 300 people. Before that, I lived in a small apartment in the city center with my mother, where I spent most of my life. However, due to financial difficulties we faced, we moved to this small town on the outskirts of the city, to a house owned by a friend of my mother. This was the first time I lived in such a place, and I must say I hated everything about it. The house was surrounded by a church, a cemetery, and an old abandoned school. You can imagine how thrilled I was to have all these eerie places around me, each one scarier than the other. The abandoned school was the closest building to us, about 20 to 30 meters from the house. Now, I can tell you that I have a whole collection of terrifying stories about that place. Enough to write a whole book about my experiences there. From the laughter of children I heard at midnight to the sleep paralysis episodes I experienced, which I had never encountered before. However, the story I'm about to tell you revolves around something far more horrifying. In that town, there was no internet, which was a complete nightmare for me since I had come from a big city. Before the move, I enjoyed spending most of my time watching videos on YouTube and playing online games. I wasn't very social, but after settling in that remote town, far from any technology, I had no choice but to entertain myself with the few games still installed on my computer, or watch the same 10 movies on a DVD over and over again. One night, it was around 3 in the morning, and everyone had gone to bed by that time. However, I stayed up playing an old game on my computer. I wore my headphones the entire time, so I couldn't hear any outside noises. But at one point, I paused the game because I thought I heard a rustling of leaves coming from the garden near my window. I took off my headphones and went to the window, leaning out to take a look, but I didn't see anything. My room was on the second floor of the house, above the kitchen, which was also connected to the door leading to the back porch. After hearing the rustling, an eerie silence fell, and I felt a surge of tension building within me. But soon that silence was shattered by the frenzied barking of our dogs echoing throughout the house. Upon hearing that, I ran down the stairs to find my mother and her husband, who were in the basement, meaning I had to pass through the kitchen to reach them. When I reached the bottom of the stairs near the kitchen, I started to hear knocking and shouting to my right, where the door to the back porch was, and that was where the dogs were barking. At that moment, I felt frozen in place. I was completely paralyzed by fear. I took off my headphones and went to the window, leaning out to take a look, but I didn't see anything. My room was on the second floor of the house, above the kitchen, which was also connected to the door leading to the back porch. After hearing the rustling, an eerie silence fell, and I felt a surge of tension building within me. But soon that silence was shattered by the frenzied barking of our dogs echoing throughout the house. Upon hearing that, I ran down the stairs to find my mother and her husband, who were in the basement, meaning I had to pass through the kitchen to reach them. When I reached the bottom of the stairs near the kitchen, I started to hear knocking and shouting to my right, where the door to the back porch was, and that was where the dogs were barking. At that moment, I felt frozen in place. I was completely paralyzed by fear. Then my stepfather emerged from the basement, and when he heard the commotion, he headed toward the back door. That's when things started to get strange. We looked through the small window in the door and saw a strange man standing on the back porch, covered in blood. I swear this was one of the most terrifying moments of my life. That man looked like a nightmare, drenched in blood from head to toe, yet he didn't seem injured. Instead, he looked incredibly desperate. He started mumbling in a frantic voice, saying he was being chased by a group of people and that they had shot him. At that moment, the man began to plead with us to let him in to hide and use our phone. My stepfather told him to stay away from the door and show him where he was injured. But as he did so, the man quickly changed his story, now saying that the blood wasn't his, but that of his friends. The tension escalated further, and when we closed the door, the man started pounding on it frantically, screaming to be let in. As he did that, his tone shifted from pleading to threatening, and he began kicking the door, threatening to kill my stepfather. While he continued to threaten, he warned my stepfather that he would call the police if we didn't let him in. Amid all this chaos, my heart was racing so hard that I felt it might explode from my chest at any moment. In that moment, my stepfather told me to grab the phone and call the police immediately. While I was on the phone with the police, I saw my mother rush to her room and then come back upstairs carrying my stepfather's gun, placing it in his hands. The man continued to pound on the door irrationally while he screamed threats. That moment turned into a painful waiting game. As I was on the line with the police, counting the minutes until they arrived, while the man kept banging on the door, trying to get in at all costs. At one point, he started screaming in a painful way, as if he were terrified, saying that the men were coming and that they were surrounding our house with their weapons and would start shooting. By that time, my stepfather had turned off all the lights in the house so that no one could see us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sirens began to approach us. My stepfather made me look out the window to alert them when they arrived, while I was in a state of panic. Then, I saw the blue and red lights stop in front of our house, and when I confirmed their arrival, I turned on the lights and waved to get their attention through the window. When the police arrived, they ordered the man to come out from the porch with his hands raised and lie on the ground. Fortunately, the man complied and didn't resist arrest, and the police took him to the station. After this incident, I couldn't return to sleep for the rest of the night. In the end, we found out that the man had originally tried to break into our basement, where my mother and her husband's room was. We also learned that this man lived near our house and had previously struggled with addiction and had gone through episodes of psychological breakdowns before. However, none of that explained where the blood on him had come from at that time, or what he intended to do if we had let him in. My name is Leon, but my friends call me Leo. I live in a small farming town in Texas, where the nearest city is about a 20-minute drive away. The story I'm about to share happened when I had just turned 18. At that time, I decided to head into town for dinner at a new sushi restaurant that had recently opened, which quickly became one of my favorite places. After dinner, I chose to visit my grandmother instead of heading straight home, where I lived alone. My grandmother lived on a farm on the outskirts of town, and getting to her house required taking a long dirt road that stretched for about half a mile. I arrived at her house around 9 p.m., and as I walked in, she greeted me warmly, along with my brother Sam, who lived with her after our grandfather passed away. I had been visiting her often since our grandfather's passing. I wanted to keep her company. One evening, Sam and I took our grandmother's dog out for a walk around the yard to let him do his business. It was around 10:30 p.m., and we found ourselves sitting outside, listening to music and chatting for a while. As time passed, I started feeling a bit cold, as it was East Texas, and the weather had been quite unpredictable lately, with hot days followed by near-freezing nights. We decided to head back inside, but just as we were about to do so, Sam suddenly noticed something moving near the metal shed, a few hundred yards from the house. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it because it was common to see raccoons and deer wandering around the yard. Besides, our grandmother's dog wasn't barking, which made me think it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Once we finally got back inside, our grandmother went to bed around 11 p.m. Sam and I took the opportunity to play some video games. As the clock ticked closer to 2:30 a.m., I realized I was quite tired and decided it was time to go home. I asked Sam to walk me to the door to make sure I got to my car safely, as I always felt a little paranoid, especially at night. He joked about it but agreed to come along. When I left the house, I turned off the lights and closed the door behind me. I felt a bit scared, as usual, because the truth is, whenever I drive alone at night, I always get anxious. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what triggered that feeling. Was it the fear of something bad happening, or perhaps the creatures hiding in the shadows? I just knew it was there, but I was getting sidetracked from the story. The truth is, I insisted that Sam walk me to the car, and eventually, he obliged. I got into my car, locked the doors, and as I was backing out, I noticed in the rearview mirror that the porch lights were going out. I drove home, which took about 10 minutes, and made myself some ice cream before settling down to watch YouTube videos. About 15 minutes later, I received a FaceTime call from Sam. The tone of his voice indicated that he was panicking. I asked him what was wrong, and after hesitating, he told me that after I left, he went back outside to listen to some music and sit on the porch. He had the music playing loudly on his phone, which usually masked any animal noises from the nearby woods. A few minutes into listening to the music, he heard what he thought was the sound of metal being struck. He quickly stopped the music to listen carefully. As he stood up and looked toward the boathouse, which was a few hundred yards away, he said he saw a faint light shining near it. But then it quickly went out. At that point, he started to feel scared, so he quietly returned inside and closed the door behind him. He ran to his room at the back of the house, grabbed our grandmother's revolver without thinking of waking her, and hurried back outside. He noticed the glow of the flashlight moving, but as soon as he spotted it, it disappeared. He crept to the edge of the concrete carport and looked into the boathouse, the revolver at his side. The only light illuminating the boathouse was the dim glow from their home. He tried to muster the most intimidating voice he could and shouted, "Who the hell is out there?" There was no immediate response, only a faint knock, which confirmed that someone was indeed there. Keep in mind that this was in the middle of the countryside, in a town with a population just over 1,000 people. The nearest houses across the lake were miles away from the main road. So, it was unlikely that a well-meaning person would just stumble upon my grandmother's house at that hour. Moreover, my grandmother had experienced issues with people snooping around the property in the past, so none of us took this lightly. I can't fathom why Sam didn't call the police, but it's worth noting that there was literally one cop in the entire town. And it was 3 a.m., meaning it would take at least 30 minutes for the cop to arrive anyway. Sam called out for the person to show himself, repeating the question over and over. He confessed to me later that he nearly wet his pants when a lanky figure emerged from the boat shed, holding a flashlight. Although Sam couldn't see any distinct features of the person, he could tell it was an older man, and it was no one we recognized, especially no one who should be in our boathouse at 3 a.m. He raised the revolver to point it at the man and shouted again, "Who the hell are you?" The man remained silent and began to walk slowly toward him. Sam cocked the revolver and gave the man a final warning. "I swear I'll shoot you. Who are you, and why are you here?" The man quickly raised his hands and said, Hey, calm down, man." His voice sounded ominous as he continued walking towards Sam. In light of the stranger advancing, Sam fired a single shot just above the man's head, which finally made him realize that Sam was serious. The guy quickly took off on foot down the driveway, and Sam yelled, "Next time, I won't miss." He then rushed inside to wake our grandmother, who somehow managed to sleep through all the commotion. She didn't seem concerned enough to call the police, but after hearing this, all I could think about were the man's true intentions. Was he just a drug addict snooping around to steal tools or money? Or did he have far more sinister motives? Another question that haunted me was how many times this had happened after my grandmother and brother went to bed, and we just didn't know about it. Had he been watching us all night? I also thought about what could have happened if my brother had turned off the lights and locked the doors behind me when I left. In the end, I realized how lucky I was that Sam was there to protect our grandmother. But this experience made me aware of the dangers that lurk in the night in our small town. I grew up in a small town in the UK where everyone knows each other, and secrets don't stay hidden for long. When I was 13, I became friends with a girl named Sarah, who lived in a house directly behind mine. We started hanging out after school. We didn't do much when we weren't at each other's houses. We would go to the local park or stroll around the street, talking about school events. Sarah smoked cigarettes, but I didn't because we were underage. She would take cigarettes from her dad or pick up used ones from the ground, which disgusted me in our neighborhood. We had a neighbor, whom I'll call Miriam to protect her privacy. Miriam was about 60 years old at the time and was known as the crazy cat lady. She lived alone with a bunch of cats, and many people in town avoided interacting with her because she was very unkempt and always smelled strange, like cat urine. While her cats were well taken care of, I couldn't understand why she had such a foul odor. Anyway, Miriam would always hang around me and Sarah, and I called Sarah Layla to protect her real identity. I would take the bus home from school, and we had to walk past Miriam's house to get to ours, as this was our usual route. Every time we passed by her house, Miriam would always stand at her garden gate and start a conversation with us. No matter how hard we tried to avoid her, she always found a way to keep us there. Whether it was through a comment or a question that annoyed me a little, because I just wanted to get home. Despite that, it didn't seem to bother Layla as much as it bothered me. She always engaged with her and stayed to chat. Sometimes when we were wandering around, Miriam would try to talk to us, especially on my behalf, which made me feel suffocated. Then I found out that Layla smoked. I don't know if it was because she smelled of cigarettes or not, but Layla admitted it when Miriam asked her about it. That day, she asked us to wait, then disappeared for a short while and came back with 2 cigarettes. She went to give me one, but I refused, then handed it to Layla and said to her with a smile, "Here you go." I felt incredibly uncomfortable, but I didn't want to show it. I didn't want to make them feel awkward or think anything wrong. Now, I'm not gay at all, but I knew that Miriam was, or at least that's what I had always heard. In the context of the situation, I wondered if she was planning something sinister. This would become clearer as the story progressed, but for a woman her age to offer cigarettes to a young girl to make her feel cool and special was inappropriate. Clearly, Miriam was not a well-meaning person. For me, at least, Layla accepted the cigarettes and kept chatting. After that, Miriam started giving Layla cigarettes every day after school. I told my friend that I thought it was weird, but she disagreed, insisting that Miriam was great because she was from the hippie generation, and told us she had smoked when she was a teenager too. I was not convinced at all, but I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want Layla to get into trouble with her parents. One weekend, it was late afternoon and we were wandering the neighborhood again when we passed by Miriam's house. She must have seen us from her living room window because she ran to the yard and then waved us over. I felt uncomfortable again because I hated being around her, but I had to follow Layla, who was given another cigarette. This time, Miriam gave Layla a lighter and asked her to smoke it while standing in the doorway. I looked around, but there was no one outside because it was winter, and the sky was very overcast. I thought Miriam was being way too hasty to let Layla smoke right in front of her, but I didn't want to leave my friend, so I stayed where I was. The woman asked us what we were going to do that day, and Layla replied that we might go into town to shop and then return to her house for dinner. Mariam nodded, then suddenly invited us to her house for orange juice. I felt very uneasy and didn't want to go inside. I realized that Layla didn't want to either, and we started exchanging glances, even though Layla was always the rebellious one. Mariam said, "Come on, I have fresh orange juice. This summer is unbearable. Come have a drink." I felt uncomfortable, so I spoke up and told her that we should go into town and that we didn't have much time left before our bus arrived, so it was better to head out right away. I then grabbed Layla's hand and pulled her away from there. After that, we didn't look back and walked in silence to the bus station. While I was there, I told Layla that Mariam was creepy and that I didn't feel good about her inviting us to her house. Fortunately, Layla agreed with me, at least at first. Later that day, when we were in Layla's room after returning from our shopping trip, she told me that Mariam probably didn't mean to be weird or have hidden bad intentions. At that point, I looked at her as if there were a horn growing out of her forehead. I said, "For Christ's sake, we're 13 and she's in her 60s. I told her there was no chance of that being a normal friendship. I told Layla that I didn't agree with her and that it was weird and irresponsible to give her cigarettes and now invite us for orange juice. That was something I couldn't ignore. Not only was it strange, but there was something about the situation that made me feel it wasn't right. I felt uncomfortable. I told Layla that there were a million reasons not to go into a stranger's house for any drinks. She could spike our drinks and kidnap us. She could have done that when I told her, but the rebellious Layla always wanted to contradict me. She told me that I was being paranoid and that I was unfair in my judgments of Mariam. She said something about not knowing if I was overprotective or biased, and she gave me a full lecture on how I shouldn't judge others based on their tastes or appearances. But my concern had nothing to do with that. It was about Mariam's behavior, which began to make me feel uncomfortable. However, unfortunately, I didn't want to push the matter further and let it pass, and I didn't talk about it again with that friend. The incident that caused the concrete veil in front of everyone's eyes to fall happened in early November. At around 5 p.m., our curfew was 7 p.m., and Layla and I were the same age, and our parents enforced almost the same rules on us by this time. It was about 4 p.m., but it was already dark. I was coming home from a friend's school, and as I was about to pass by Mariam's house, I saw Layla coming out of Mariam's house, smiling. I felt my heart freeze. I couldn't believe it. She must have closed her door quickly and ran towards me, greeted me, then turned to go to my house. I asked her what she was doing with Mariam, and she couldn't tell me. She just smiled, but I didn't think it was anything good. Despite that, even though I didn't know why, I knew something was wrong. The whole way home, I was thinking about everything that could have happened inside Mariam's house. She was speaking quickly, and her face was flushed. I asked her directly, "What happened? Why are you smiling?" But she didn't answer, so I let her go, and I certainly didn't expect to see her again that evening. When I got home, I decided to go to bed early, just because I was feeling so anxious. I was very angry with Layla for hanging out with Mariam after everything I had told her, but I was also angry with myself for not being able to put a stop to such things. The next day, Layla called me at school. Instead of asking me about how I was doing, she asked me what I thought was really going on between them. I told her I was really worried, and I could see the shock in her eyes. She said, sorry, I shouldn't have gone over there. I promise I won't go again." She told me about how Mariam invited her to come over again, and she apologized for going out. She told me that Mariam took her by the hand and made her sit down. She made her tea and gave her sweets, then took her to the living room and asked her to stay longer. Mariam was bringing Layla sweets and started asking her about her friends, then asked her if she wanted to have another cigarette. I can't describe how shocked I was. I couldn't even speak, but I really wanted to hit Layla at that point. I felt offended by how she was treating my feelings. After that, Layla admitted to me that she was smoking with Mariam, and she told me she would try not to hang out with Mariam again. By the time Layla got us out of that, I realized I needed to talk to her mother. Layla's parents were always distant from her and didn't spend much time with her, so I knew I needed help. I thought about how they would react to Mariam and find out about it. After a little thought, I went to Layla's house and looked at her mother through her front window, but she wasn't home. So I decided to go back to my house and wait to see how things would go. Days went by, and then the news I had been waiting for came. One morning, after a week, Layla's dad came home, but he wasn't alone. He came with the police and went straight to Mariam's house. I ran a few streets behind them because I wanted to know what was going on. I felt happy to talk about it. Layla's parents had discovered everything, and they wanted to know more about Mariam. After a short while, I was able to see Mariam talking to the officer, realizing that the nightmare of her actions was beginning to unravel. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but I couldn't move my feet. I just stood there watching her talk to the police. After that, the officer took Mariam into the car and drove her to detention. I sat on the side of the sidewalk and put my head in my arms, and I heard Layla's dad talking to the investigator. It was truly a painful experience, but in the end, it was comforting to be there. I felt a mix of fear and relief. The police left and went on their way after they finished everything. I didn't think Mariam would be as bad as we thought, but over time I realized she had some strange behaviors, especially after realizing she was offering cigarettes to Layla. I couldn't get over that. I can't tell you how Layla was affected by her experience with Mariam, but she was emotional, and I know she suffered severe trauma in her relationship with that woman. In the end, that experience made us better friends. We realized we always had to protect each other and be careful about who we were around. So, that was my experience with that woman, and I hope it's helpful. I grew up in a small town in Nebraska, and during the 18 years I spent there, only 2 major events occurred. The first, which might be considered the best thing, is that I wasn't born to be someone important, but for me, that meant something special. The second, which might be considered the worst thing, happened when Chris Baldwin set fire to his garage, which can be seen as the worst thing that happened in our town. This may not make sense to you now, but once you hear the story, I promise you'll understand it completely. It was a Sunday night, and I was a freshman in high school at the time. I was still at that age when my friends and I would go out biking at night. You know, it was fun and healthy, a way to get some exercise. That night, we were riding our bikes when we suddenly saw another kid from our class driving his car down the street at full speed. When we realized where he was headed, We all gasped in unison and said, "Oh my God, Chris's garage is on fire." At that moment, we all took off on our bikes toward the burning place, which was Chris Baldwin's garage, and when we got there, I already saw police and firefighters at the scene. They arrived within seconds. We tried to get closer, but an officer immediately told us to stay back. We thought we were already far enough away, so we were quite confused. However, we did exactly as we were told. That's when we started hearing all these bangs and crashes coming from the garage, while the firefighters were desperately trying to put out the flames. Suddenly, there were several explosions, and we all ran to hide. We had no idea what was happening, but we were really scared for a moment. I thought the Baldwin house was about to explode or something like that, and when we realized it, we all ran to hide until the next morning after the fire. Everyone at school was talking about it and waiting for Chris to tell them what happened, but he didn't show up to any classes. Rumors started spreading among the kids that paramedics were seen at the fire loading someone into an ambulance, so we assumed that Chris might have been injured in the fire. However, other witnesses claimed that Chris was not taken out of the house injured, but that his body was completely burned. On the other hand, some claimed he simply went to live with relatives because his house was reduced to ashes. Many stories began to emerge, but the truth would come later. The morning after the incident, authorities finally reported on the event. 3 generations had lived in that house, and Chris was one of the 4 children in the family, but nothing specific was known except for speculation. Logically, many other rumors started to circulate, and it wasn't until the next day that our high school principal called us all to a special meeting where we really got some concrete answers. I remember the whole school entered the gym, where the county sheriff and a few deputies stood, each with a very serious look on their faces. Once we all sat down, the principal began by saying that the county sheriff had something important to talk to us about, and as he stepped forward and removed his hat, I swear we heard a pin drop. We knew it would be something about the Baldwin family, but we weren't sure what exactly. I swear, I would never have guessed in a million years. I won't pretend that I can remember exactly what the man said, because all of this happened more than 20 years ago, but essentially it went like this. You've all heard about the fire at the Baldwin house, and I'm sure you've all heard about the tragic loss of life today. I'm sorry I have to be the one to tell you this, but Chris, your classmate, is the one who died. At that moment, we heard a collective gasp echo through the gym, and the sheriff paused for a second. Before continuing, he said they were still trying to figure out how the fire started, so he encouraged anyone with information about Chris to come forward. You didn't have to do that right then. You could call my office anytime, and we could have a more private conversation. But please, if anyone has anything to say or remembers any strange or unusual behavior from Chris in the days leading up to the fire, I implore you to come forward. That was the first indication we realized that something was truly wrong. I think they wanted to handle the whole situation discreetly, and then we fully understood why. Everyone's initial reaction was one of shock and deep sorrow. The kids were horrified at the death of one of their own in such a horrific way. But if the police had told us the real reason behind this terrible tragedy, I don't think people would have grieved as much. They would have been angry and perhaps even relieved that it had happened. It took several more days for the truth to emerge, and by that time, the town decided to place the blame on our parents. I remember there was a town meeting where my parents asked me to finish my homework before they returned home. But all I did was play video games for about 2 hours before they got back. I thought they would be angry because I hadn't done anything at all, but they weren't angry. Instead, they had those strange, sad looks on their faces, just like the ones they had when my grandfather died. Suddenly, they sat down with me in the TV room and asked me how much I knew about Chris. I didn't tell them much. I was just studying Spanish with him, but we never talked. Then they started asking me a bunch of other questions about whether Chris had been angry with me, or if I liked him, things like that. And in the end, I simply told them that it was clear they knew something about Chris, and they better tell me right away. I thought it was about his suicide. If that were the case, at that time, I was old enough to handle the truth, or so I thought. But that's not what happened. I was wrong because the truth about Chris's death was something that would take me years to fully grasp. In reality, Chris didn't commit suicide. He lost his life accidentally when his garage exploded while he was trying to make a bomb. Yes, that's how horrifying it was. He was making a prototype for a bomb he planned to use to blow up the school. When I heard that, I was completely shocked. I was terrified. It turned out that after conducting a lot of research and investigations into the cause of the fire in the garage, they realized that all the necessary elements for making a simple bomb similar to those used by Arab terrorists were present. However, they didn't realize what his plan was until they found Chris's journals, where the boy detailed everything he intended to do, when, and how. When this information was revealed, the entire town was left in complete shock. It was something no one expected and revealed a level of evil that no one had seen in Chris through his writings. It was also known that his goal was to kill some kids. He hated them deeply. However, it was not very clear whether he was a victim of bullying from those kids, as that was never revealed in his journal writings. Essentially, he talked there about the hatred he felt toward his classmates and school and his fantasies of blowing things up. So it was never known whether he sought revenge for something they did to him, or if he was just a cruel person, and that was it. But without a doubt, this is the most terrifying incident I have ever witnessed. I had always dreamed of living in a small town where life moved at a slower pace and the familiar faces of neighbors brought a comforting sense of belonging. The idea of peaceful evenings spent in front of a crackling fire with the scent of pine wafting in from outside, seemed idyllic. So when I landed a teaching job in a tiny village tucked away in the woods of Washington, I seized the opportunity with open arms. The town was called Ashwood, a name that conjured images of rustic charm, and it lay hidden deep within the forest, accessible by only one winding road. Driving into Ashwood for the first time felt like stepping into a storybook. The tall trees formed a natural arch overhead, their branches swaying gently as if they were watching my approach. I brushed aside the strange feeling that crept into my mind. I was simply excited for a fresh start. Ashwood promised everything I longed for: solitude, nature, and a quaint old house that was available for rent at an unbelievably low price. I moved in late summer, just as the school year was about to kick off. The first week was a dream. The locals were friendly but distant. not in a rude way, but in a manner common to those who had lived their entire lives in the same place, where strangers came and went like the changing seasons. My house was perched at the edge of town, right where the woods began, and from my back porch, all I could see were trees stretching for miles. The tranquility of Ashwood was mesmerizing, but sometimes it felt too quiet. At night, the silence pressed in around me, and I'd wake up with the unsettling sensation that someone was watching me through the windows. I chalked it up to nerves. After all, everything was new. New town, new job, new life. I was bound to feel a little jumpy. About a month into my stay, something strange happened one evening. After finishing my lesson plans for the next day, I settled onto the porch with a steaming cup of coffee, soaking in the cool air as the first hints of autumn brushed against my skin. That's when I noticed a flickering light deep in the woods. At first, I thought it was just someone with a flashlight, perhaps a camper. But as I focused on it, I realized it was hovering, unmoving between the trees. Unnerved, I got up and went inside, locking the door behind me. I dismissed it as nothing more than a passerby, but that night I was jolted awake by the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the leaves outside, but then I realized it was coming from inside the house. Sitting up in bed, my heart raced as I strained to hear. The whispers were faint, like a dozen voices murmuring just below the surface of the air, too quiet to make out any words. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, creeping through the dark house to check the doors and windows. Everything was locked. The whispers stopped as abruptly as they had started, and I stood in the middle of my living room, feeling foolish. The next morning, I mentioned it to one of my coworkers, Hannah, who had lived in Ashwood her entire life. She gave me a strange look and said, "Sometimes the wind plays tricks out here. You'll get used to it." I wanted to ask more, but the conversation shifted, and I let it go. That night, however, the whispers returned. I woke up again, drenched in sweat, the same murmurs filling the air around me, but this time they were louder. I couldn't tell where they were coming from. It felt like they were all around me, in the walls, in the floor. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window. That's when I saw it. The light, the same one from before, flickering deep in the woods. Only now there were more, perhaps a dozen, maybe 24, all hovering just beyond the tree line like lanterns swaying in the breeze. I should have called the police. I should have packed up and left right then, but I didn't. I told myself it was some local tradition or festival. Maybe I was just stressed and imagining things. The next day, I went back to the diner for lunch. It was a Friday, and the place was packed with locals. I casually mentioned the lights to a group sitting nearby. The room fell silent. Everyone stared at me as if I had said something offensive. "You shouldn't go near the woods at night," an older man muttered. "Best to stay inside when it gets dark." I laughed it off, but inside I felt rattled. Why wouldn't anyone explain what was going on? Why did they all act like the woods were something to fear? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the whispers. They didn't come, but the light did. Around midnight, I saw it flickering again through my bedroom window, closer this time. I don't know why I did it, but I grabbed my coat and flashlight and stepped outside. I had to know what it was. Maybe it was just kids messing around, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I walked through the yard and into the trees, my breath coming out in shaky puffs. The light stayed ahead of me, always just out of reach. "Hello," I called out, but no one answered. The deeper I went into the woods, the thicker the trees became. The air turned cold, unnaturally so, and my flashlight flickered. The light ahead grew brighter. Suddenly the ground beneath my feet felt wrong. It was soft, like I was walking on a thick layer of leaves. I knelt down and brushed them aside. Beneath the leaves were stones. No, not stones, gravestones, old and crumbling, covered in moss. There were dozens of them hidden beneath the forest floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to leave, but the light was gone. The whispers returned, louder than ever, surrounding me. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing, just darkness. Panic surged through me, and I ran, stumbling over the uneven ground, branches scratching at my face and arms. I don't know how long I ran, but when I finally reached my house, I slammed the door behind me, locking it, gasping for air. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent, just outside the window. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care about the job, the town, or any of it. I just wanted to get out. But when I drove to the edge of town, something stopped me in my tracks. An old, weathered sign, covered in vines. It had been hidden by the trees before, but now it was clear as day. Ashwood Cemetery, established 1846. My heart sank as I stared at the sign. The gravestones in the woods were real, but this wasn't just a cemetery. This was a town. How could the whispers start again, louder now, rising from the trees? I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them. The lights, dozens of them, flickering through the forest, moving toward me. My heart raced, and I floored the gas pedal, not stopping until I was miles away, past the forest, past the town, and out onto the highway. I never went back. I searched for Ashwood online after that, combing through records and maps, but it was as if the town had never existed. No history, no traces, swallowed by the forest long ago, forgotten by time. But I remember it. I remember the lights. Every night when darkness falls, I can still hear the whispers in my dreams, calling me back to Ashwood. I'll never go back. Not again. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed just a little longer, if I had followed the lights into the heart of the woods. And I wonder who, or rather what, is still out there, waiting for me to return. I first heard about Ashford by accident, a chance encounter that would lead me down a path I never expected. I was driving from Boston to Portland, taking the scenic route through New England's back roads, when my car broke down in a sleepy little town. The mechanic, an older man with grease-stained hands, told me it would take a couple of days to get the part I needed. With some time to kill, I found myself in a quaint diner, surrounded by the smells of coffee and bacon, where fate would introduce me to Ashford. It was one of those conversations you stumble upon without meaning to. Two old men sat at the corner booth, their voices low and conspiratorial. I leaned in slightly, pretending to focus on my menu, but their hushed tones caught my attention, especially when I heard the name Ashford. I had driven through this part of Maine dozens of times and thought I knew every town within 100 miles, but I had never heard of Ashford before. Well, you know, one man said, his voice gravelly, before trailing off. The other grunted, glancing around as if someone might be eavesdropping. They should have let that place die when it wanted to, he said. But now it's still out there. You go looking for it. You won't like what you find. Those words piqued my curiosity. A town that wasn't on any map? I had spent years hiking through remote parts of Maine, photographing ghost towns and abandoned places. The idea of a lost town was too tempting to pass up. After the two men left, I called over to the waitress. "Do you know where Ashford is?" Her hand froze halfway to the coffee pot, and she looked at me, eyes wide, as if I had just said something I wasn't supposed to. "No," she replied flatly, turning away, but not before I noticed the tremor in her hand. That sealed it. I had to find Ashford. The next morning, after poking around a few local libraries and coming up empty, I asked the mechanic if he knew anything more. He shrugged, wiping his hands on a rag. "You want Ashford? You gotta head north toward the foothills. But listen, don't go there. Some things are better left alone." I should have listened to him, but I didn't. I set out that afternoon, following his vague directions. The road narrowed as I drove, turning from paved to gravel, and then to little more than dirt as the forest thickened around me. The trees here were ancient, towering over the road like sentinels, blocking out the sunlight and creating a canopy of green. My GPS gave up, and I had to rely on instinct, following the few signs that pointed toward Ashford Ridge. By the time I saw the first building, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees. Ashford appeared suddenly, as if it had been waiting, hidden just out of sight. The buildings were old, very old, wooden houses with sagging roofs and darkened windows. The streets were empty. There were no cars, no people, nothing. I parked at the edge of what must have been the main street and got out. The air felt thick, heavy with the kind of stillness you only find in places long forgotten. I started walking down the street, my footsteps echoing off the cracked pavement. Every house I passed was the same. Abandoned windows covered in grime, doors hanging off their hinges. The town felt untouched by time, like it had been frozen in place, except for one unsettling detail. There were lights on in some of the houses, not the warm glow of electricity, but faint, flickering lights, like candles burning in the windows. I tried knocking on a few doors, but no one answered. The houses were locked tight. I found myself in front of what looked like an old general store, its sign faded and unreadable. The windows were broken, but inside I saw movement. Something shifting in the shadows. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding too loud in the still air. No answer. Compelled by curiosity, I walked in. The air inside was musty, thick with dust, and the shelves were still stocked with ancient goods, cans of soup, jars of preserves, all covered in a layer of grime. It was like the people had left in a hurry, but no one had bothered to come back. At the back of the store, I found a staircase leading down into what looked like a cellar. The door at the top was open, and faint whispers echoed up from below. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, but something compelled me to move forward. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, each step making me feel more and more like I was descending into something I couldn't come back from. The whispers grew louder, not voices exactly, but more like a sound, a presence. The cellar was empty when I reached the bottom, just a dirt floor and wooden beams holding up the ceiling. But in the corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A group of old wooden mannequins. They were lined up in a circle, dressed in what looked like antique clothing, tattered dresses, old suits, all dusty and decayed. Their faces were blank, but their heads were turned toward the center of the circle, where a single candle flickered on the ground. The whispers stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at them, feeling like something was watching me, waiting. The air grew colder, and I swear I could hear something shifting behind me, but I was too terrified to turn around. Finally, I bolted. I ran out of the store, back to my car, and sped down the road, not caring if I hit a tree or skidded off into the woods. I just needed to get out. I didn't sleep that night. The images of the mannequins, the whispers, the lights, none of it made sense, but it stayed with me, gnawing at my thoughts. The next morning, I packed up my things, retrieved my car from the mechanic, and left that part of Maine for good. But Ashford never left me. It's been months now, and I can't stop thinking about that town. I've searched everywhere for information, but there's nothing. No records, no history, not even a mention on any old maps. Then 2 nights ago, the whispers came back. I was lying in bed when I heard them, faint at first, just like in the cellar. I sat up, heart pounding, convinced it was just my imagination. But then I saw the light out the window, deep in the woods behind my house. There was a faint flickering glow, just like the candles in Ashford. It was far away, barely visible, but it was there. Last night, it was closer. And tonight, I can already hear the whispers again, louder now, like they're right outside. I don't know what's coming for me, but I think it followed me back from Ashford. Whatever that town is, whatever it was, I think it wants me to return, but I won't go back. Not until it comes for me, and I know it will. I never intended to end up in Pine Hollow. It was one of those towns you stumble upon when you're lost, tucked deep in the dense Maine woods, forgotten by time and progress. I had set out with high hopes, seeking a weekend getaway, a chance to escape the bustling city for a few days. But fate had different plans for me. Somewhere back on Route 12, my GPS failed, leaving me to navigate through a maze of winding roads shrouded in thick fog and bordered by towering pines. I felt the weight of isolation settle in, the kind that presses on your chest and makes every breath feel heavy. I had no idea that I was driving deeper into a place I never knew existed. As I pulled into town, the first thing I noticed was the sign at the entrance. Welcome to Pine Hollow. Population 326. The paint was chipped and barely legible, as if it had faded into obscurity, along with the town itself. Pine Hollow looked like a place frozen in time, where life moved at a slower pace, or maybe had simply stopped altogether. Main Street was lined with old weathered buildings, an antique store, a diner, a post office that appeared long unused. But the silence struck me first. Even in the middle of the day, there were no sounds. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, not even the faint hum of distant traffic. Just a heavy, suffocating quiet. I pulled up to the diner, thinking it would be a good place to ask for directions. The neon sign in the window flickered faintly. Open, though the place looked anything but welcoming. As I stepped inside, the smell of old grease and something sour hit me like a wall. A few patrons were scattered at the counter, an old man in a trucker cap, a woman in a tattered apron, and a younger guy staring blankly at the wall. Not one of them looked up when I entered. It was as if I didn't exist. Excuse me, I said, clearing my throat. The woman behind the counter blinked slowly, as if waking from a trance. I'm a little lost. Do you know the quickest way to get back to Route 12? She didn't answer immediately, just stared at me with dull eyes. After an uncomfortable pause, she finally spoke. Ain't no quick way back from here. You're in Pine Hollow now. Her voice was flat, empty, as if she had recited the same line 100 times before. I glanced at the other patrons, but they still didn't move. They didn't even seem to breathe. Could you at least point me in the right direction? I muttered. She didn't respond, just picked up a dirty rag and began wiping the counter, though it didn't seem to get any cleaner. Feeling more uneasy by the second, I turned to leave. But just before I reached the door, the old man at the counter spoke up. Once you're here, there ain't no leaving. I stopped, his voice raspy like he hadn't used it in a long time. Slowly, I turned back to face him. His eyes were fixed on me now, dark and glassy, as if something vital was missing behind them. Excuse me? I asked, forcing a smile. What do you mean by that? He didn't answer, just looked past me toward the window. I followed his gaze and saw what he was staring at. The fog outside had thickened, curling around the buildings like it was alive. You're not the first, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, and you won't be the last. I didn't wait to hear more. A sense of urgency surged through me, and I hurried back to my car, the feeling of eyes on my back as I pushed through the diner door. Outside, the air felt heavier, colder. The fog had rolled in so thick that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. But I wasn't about to stick around to figure out what the old man meant. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and sped down the road, desperate to get out of that place. But Pine Hollow had other plans. I must have driven in circles for hours. Every road I took led me back to the same stretch of Main Street. The fog seemed to swallow everything beyond the town's limits, and no matter which way I turned, I always ended up back where I started. Back in Pine Hollow. As daylight faded, so did any hope of escape. I parked the car in front of an old gas station that looked like it hadn't been operational in decades. With no choice left, I set out to explore the town on foot, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could help. As I wandered through the deserted streets, I noticed something odd. The buildings looked the same as when I first arrived, but there were small details that felt wrong. The windows were dark, yet every so often I caught a glimpse of movement inside, shadows flitting past, as if something or someone was watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I came across an old house at the edge of town, its paint peeling and windows cracked. A light glowed warmly inside, drawing me in like a moth to a flame. I don't know why I went inside, but something about that light felt different, as if it was calling me. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the house was in shambles, furniture covered in dust, wallpaper peeling from the walls. But the light, a flickering oil lamp in the corner, seemed to hold a strange pull, as though it contained some kind of answer. As I reached out to touch it, a voice spoke from the shadows. You shouldn't have come here. I spun around, heart racing. There, standing in the doorway, was a woman. She looked out of place, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her hair in loose waves framing a face far too pale. Her eyes were filled with fear. Who are you? I demanded. What is this place? Her gaze shifted to the lamp, and her voice trembled. This town, it's not what it seems. You have to leave before they find you. Who? I asked, my voice rising in panic. Who's going to find me? She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the window. Look, she whispered, her voice shaking. They come with the fog. I looked out the window, my breath catching in my throat. Through the thickening fog, I saw them, figures, dozens of them, moving silently between the trees and houses. Their shapes were human but wrong, like shadows cast in the wrong direction. They moved unnaturally, their limbs too long, their movements jerky, as if they didn't quite belong to this world. What the hell are those? I whispered, backing away from the window. They're what's left, the woman said, her voice barely audible. The town takes people. It traps them here, and once the fog comes, it's too late. A chill ran down my spine. How do I get out? She shook her head. There's no way out, not once you've seen them. I refused to believe it. I bolted for the door, determined to escape. But the moment I stepped outside, I saw them. The figures were closer now, moving toward me, their faces hidden in the fog. The whispering began, low and unintelligible, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. I ran. I don't know how far or for how long, but the town seemed to stretch on forever. Every street looked the same, every building a mirror of the last. And the fog, it was everywhere, thick and suffocating, filled with those dark, twisted figures. At some point, I collapsed, my legs giving out beneath me. The whispering grew louder, closer until I could feel the cold breath of the figures at my back. Then, darkness. I woke up in my car, the sun shining, the fog gone. Pine Hollow looked different in the daylight, normal almost, but the town was just as empty, just as silent. I don't know how long I've been here. Days? Weeks? Time doesn't seem to work the same in this place. I've tried to leave, but the roads always lead me back. The people, the real ones, are gone, replaced by the shadows that watch me from the fog. If you ever find Pine Hollow, don't stop. Don't ask for directions. Don't go inside. Because once the fog comes, you'll never leave, and neither will I. I wasn't supposed to end up in Blackwater. It was one of those small, forgotten towns on the edge of nowhere. The kind that no one ever talks about. Not intentionally, anyway. My trip was supposed to take me straight through the Appalachian backroads, where winding roads promised picturesque views of nature. However, a wrong turn led me deep into the mountains, further away from civilization than I had ever been. By the time my phone lost signal, I knew it was already too late to turn back. As the sun sank behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the narrow road, a sense of unease settled over me. My gas tank was nearly empty, and every mile felt like I was driving deeper into a place that wanted to keep me. That's when I saw the sign, Blackwater, population 512. The letters were faded, and the sign leaned to one side as if it hadn't been maintained in years. I figured I'd stop, ask for directions, and maybe fuel up if there was a gas station. But as I pulled into the town, something immediately felt wrong. It wasn't just the stillness, though that was unnerving enough. It was the absence of life. The streets were deserted, the houses dark and quiet, with no cars, no people. Nothing but a chilling silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. I pulled up to what looked like a general store. Its windows were coated in dust, and the open sign dangled crookedly on the door. My footsteps echoed unnaturally as I approached the entrance, pushing the door open. I half expected it to be locked, but it creaked loudly, giving way. The smell hit me first, a musty, damp odor that reminded me of a basement left untouched for years. Inside, the shelves were sparsely stocked with canned goods, their labels faded and peeling. "Hello? Anyone here?" I called out, hoping someone would hear me. No response. The air felt thick and oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I walked toward the counter, where a bell sat tarnished and rusty. I rang it once, twice. Still, no one came. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a soft creak behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. The door had drifted shut, sealing me in with the stillness. I should have left right then, but I needed gas and directions. Maybe there was someone in the back. Feeling an unsettling mix of curiosity and dread, I stepped behind the counter, as if breaking some unspoken rule. I moved deeper into the store and found a narrow hallway leading to a door marked office. The door was ajar, just enough for me to see that the room beyond was dark. "Hello?" I called again, my voice wavering slightly. There was a sound, faint like a whisper, or maybe just the wind through a crack in the window. But it didn't feel like wind. I took a step forward, the wooden floor creaking beneath me. I reached out to push the door open, when suddenly, the temperature in the hallway dropped. I could see my breath now, hanging in the air like a ghostly mist. My heart hammered in my chest as the door creaked all the way open on its own. There, in the dim light of the office, I saw it. A figure stood motionless by the window. At first I thought it was a person, a woman maybe, judging by the long, tattered dress she wore. But something about her was off. Her movements were too stiff, too unnatural. And then she turned. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes dark hollows that seemed to stare through me. Not at me, Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Just a low, guttural moan that sent icy terror flooding through my veins. I stumbled back, crashing into the shelves as I tried to turn and run. The cans clattered to the floor, but I barely heard them over the pounding in my ears. I bolted for the front door, not daring to look back, and slammed through it into the cold night air. The town outside was just as empty, but the stillness had been replaced by something far worse. The streets were now shrouded in mist, a thick, suffocating fog that clung to the ground like it was alive. Through that fog I saw them, figures just like the woman, walking silently through the town. Their movements were slow, deliberate, their hollow eyes fixed on nothing in particular. They moved in and out of the shadows, fading in and out of sight like wraiths. My stomach churned with dread. These weren't people. They were something else, something that didn't belong in this world. Panicking, I ran to my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. As soon as I turned the ignition, the headlights flickered on, cutting through the fog. But the light didn't reveal anything comforting. More figures, dozens of them now, moving toward me. Their faces were pale, expressionless, their eyes dark voids. I slammed the car into reverse, spinning the tires as I sped backward, desperate to get away. But no matter how fast I drove, the town seemed to stretch on forever. Every street looked the same, winding and narrow, leading me deeper into Blackwater. Then I saw it, a gas station up ahead, its lights flickering weakly in the fog. I pulled in, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I could fuel up and find a way out. The pumps were old and rusted, but they still worked. I filled up as quickly as I could, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as the figures drew closer. Just as I was about to get back in the car, a voice called out from behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I froze. It was a man's voice, weak and hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in years. I turned slowly, and there, standing in the doorway of the gas station's tiny store, was an old man. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones, but his eyes were alive with fear. "You have to leave," he rasped, "now, before they take you too." "Who are they?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "The people of Blackwater," he said, his voice trembling. "They've been dead for years, but the town won't let them rest. And now that you've seen them, it won't let you leave either." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean? I have to get out of here." He shook his head, his eyes filled with a deep, hopeless sadness. "Once you're in Blackwater, you belong to it. The town doesn't let anyone go." I didn't wait to hear more. I jumped back into my car, my hands shaking as I floored the gas. The fog seemed to part in front of me as I sped down the road, the figures fading into the mist behind me. I drove for what felt like hours, maybe days. The fog never lifted, and the roads never changed. Every turn I made brought me back to the same place, the heart of Blackwater. The buildings were always there, looming out of the mist like silent sentinels waiting. I don't know how long I've been here. Days blur into nights, and the fog never lifts. The figures watch me now, always just at the edge of the mist, never getting closer, but never leaving either. The town doesn't want me to leave, and I've realized now that I can't. There's no escape from Blackwater. If you ever find yourself driving through the Appalachian Mountains and see a sign for Blackwater, turn around. Don't stop. Don't look for help, because once you're here, there's no going back. I still don't know why I decided to visit Hollow Creek. The name itself wasn't familiar, and the map had shown it as nothing more than a dot along a forgotten stretch of highway in the Midwest. But when my car broke down on a long road trip back to Chicago, the nearest tow company directed me to this small, seemingly innocent town. I figured I'd be in and out within a day, just long enough to get my car fixed and grab a bite to eat. I couldn't have been more wrong. It was late afternoon when I rolled into Hollow Creek, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No kids playing, no dogs barking, no sounds of traffic, just an eerie, unnatural stillness. The streets were lined with old, worn-out houses, most of them, looking like they hadn't been lived in for years. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should, creeping across the ground, like fingers reaching for something. I parked in front of the town's only gas station, which looked as ancient as the rest of the town. The pump handles were rusted, and the open sign in the window flickered weakly, as if it might go out at any moment. I stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly, but no one was behind the counter. The shelves were half empty, filled with old dust-covered snacks, and the place smelled faintly of gasoline and something musty like damp earth. "Hello," I called out, but there was no answer. I wandered toward the back, hoping someone would appear, maybe an attendant, who could point me toward a mechanic. As I turned a corner, I saw him, an old man sitting in a chair, hunched over with his back to me. He didn't move when I entered, just sat there, his shoulders rising and falling in a slow, labored rhythm. Excuse me," I said cautiously. "I'm looking for a mechanic." My car broke down a few miles outside of town. The old man's head tilted slightly, but he didn't turn around. I took a step closer, the wooden floor creaking beneath my feet. Something about him made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. His breathing was shallow, like he was struggling to draw air. "I just need directions." I tried again. Finally, he spoke, his voice a raspy whisper. "Ain't no leaving Hollow Creek once you've come." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" The man let out a soft chuckle, one that sent a shiver racing down my spine slowly. He stood, but still didn't turn to face me. "Folks don't just pass through here," he rasped. "You've been drawn in just like the rest of us." I backed up a step, heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" Before he could answer, the bell above the door chimed again. I turned and saw a figure enter, a woman, pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken, her clothes faded, as if she'd been walking through the dust for years. Her gaze locked onto me, and something in her expression made my blood run cold. "You should leave," she whispered, though her words contradicted the old man's warning. "If you can still leave, you need to do it now." I don't understand," I stammered, but she stepped closer, her hands trembling. "They don't like it when new blood comes," she said, her voice shaking. "Once the sun sets, you're theirs." The old man finally turned, his face twisted into a grim smile. "Too late for that, darling," he said softly, his eyes dark and empty. "The shadows know you're here now." I bolted for the door, my heart racing, panic gripping me as I burst outside. The sky was nearly dark, now, the last traces of sunlight disappearing behind the horizon. The air had turned cold, unnaturally cold, and the town seemed even more deserted than before. But something was different. The shadows, they were moving at first. I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But as I looked closer, I saw them, the shadows of the buildings, of the trees, of the cars. They were stretching, twisting unnaturally, like they were alive. They slithered across the ground, inching toward me, and with them came a low guttural whispering that I couldn't quite make out. But the sound made my skin crawl. I jumped into my car, desperate to escape, but the engine wouldn't start. I turned the key again and again, but nothing happened. The shadows were getting closer now, creeping up the sides of the buildings, swirling around the street like a living, breathing entity, frantic. I looked for a place to hide. That's when I saw it. A small hotel at the edge of the town, its neon sign flickering like a weak heartbeat. I didn't have much choice. I grabbed my backpack and ran the shadows, nipping at my heels as I sprinted toward the entrance. The door was unlocked, and I slammed it shut behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The lobby was empty, just like everywhere else in Hollow Creek. But there was something worse here. The air was thick, heavy with a feeling of being watched, and it wasn't long before I realized I wasn't alone. Into the far corner of the room. I still don't know why I decided to visit Hollow Creek. The name wasn't familiar, and it appeared as just a dot on a map of a forgotten stretch of highway in the Midwest. But when my car broke down during a long trip back to Chicago, the towing company directed me to this small town. I thought I would go in and out of Hollow Creek within a day, just long enough to fix my car and grab a snack. But things didn't go as planned. It was afternoon when I entered the town, and the first thing that struck me was the eerie quiet. There were no children playing, no barking dogs, and no sounds of traffic, just a heavy silence. The streets were lined with old, dilapidated houses, most of which looked as if they hadn't been inhabited for years. The sun was setting, casting long, strange shadows that seemed to crawl across the ground. I stopped in front of the only gas station in town, which appeared as old and worn as the rest of the town, with rusty pump handles and a flickering sign that looked like it might go out at any moment. I stepped inside, and the bell above the door chimed softly, but there was no one behind the counter. The shelves were half empty, filled with old snacks, and the place had a faint smell of gasoline mixed with something musty. I called out, but there was no answer. I wandered toward the back, hoping to find someone who could help me. Around the corner, I spotted an old man sitting in a chair. He didn't move when I entered, just sat there, lost in thought. I approached him, a strange feeling creeping up my spine. "Excuse me," I said cautiously. "I'm looking for a mechanic. My car broke down a few miles outside of town." The old man tilted his head slightly, but didn't turn to face me. As I stepped closer, I tried to ask again. "I just need directions." Finally, he spoke in a raspy voice. "Don't leave Hollow Creek once you arrive." I froze. "What do you mean?" The old man let out a faint chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. "Here, people don't pass through without reason." I stepped back, my heart racing. Before I could ask anything else, a pale, thin woman with sunken eyes walked in. Her clothes were faded, as if she had been walking through dust for years. She looked at me with a sense of dread, and something in her expression made my blood run cold. "You need to leave," she whispered, "if you still can." I didn't understand what she meant, but she approached me, her hands trembling. "They don't like it when new blood comes in." Her words were strange, yet there was something in her tone that made me feel uneasy. Then the old man turned to me with a grim smile. "It's too late now. The shadows know you're here." I felt an overwhelming urge to flee. I rushed toward the door, my heart pounding. As I stepped outside, I noticed that the sky was darkening quickly. The air had turned cold, and the town appeared more lifeless than before. But strange shadows began to move, as if they were watching me. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but when I looked closer, I saw the shadows twisting unnaturally, as if they were alive. I sprinted toward my car, but the engine wouldn't start. I turned the key over and over, but nothing happened. The shadows were now creeping closer, crawling across the street. I felt panic rising, but I had no choice but to seek refuge. I spotted a small motel on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering like a weak heartbeat. I dashed toward the entrance and slammed the door behind me. The lobby was empty, but there was an unsettling feeling in the air. In the far corner of the room stood a tall, thin figure, its face obscured by shadows. I felt paralyzed, as if it were watching me. Despite my fear, I knew I had to find an escape, but the whispers grew louder, as if they were closing in on me. I stood before a door, desperately wanting to flee. But as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The room was empty, except for an old bed and a single chair. Panic surged within me as the whispers filled the room, rising in volume. I began to feel trapped. Then, more figures emerged from the shadows, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. They whispered in unison, their voices merging into a horrifying chorus, warning me not to stay any longer. Fear tightened around my throat, choking off my words before they could form, but it was too late. The shadows surged forward, enveloping me in a cold, suffocating grip. I struggled, but there was no escape. The figures reached out, their icy hands pulling me into the darkness. The last thing I saw was the twisted face of the old man from the gas station smiling at me as the shadows consumed me completely. I am still here, trapped in endless darkness. If you ever find yourself lost on a back road and see a sign pointing to Hollow Creek, turn back before the shadows find you, because once they do, there's no way back. If you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. Taking a wrong turn was the first mistake. Relying on those smiles was the second. The day began like any other. I packed my gear and set off on a solo hike through the Smoky Mountains, a city man skilled at exploring the quieter corners of nature. I had done this sort of thing dozens of times before, but something about the stillness of the thick forest always called me back. I'm a bit of a loner, and I always find solace in solitude. I've had my fair share of life's blows. Just a few years ago, I lost my brother in a car accident. Since then, these hikes have been my therapy and a way to find some peace. I never expected this hike to turn into anything other than the usual trek through thick foliage. I felt the weight of my backpack and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I had mapped out a trail that would take me through some of the lesser-known paths. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip, just me and nature. No distractions, no people. But somewhere along the way, I must have misread the map or maybe got lost in my own thoughts. I found myself on a path I didn't recognize. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, I realized I had strayed off course. I pulled out my map, trying to get my bearings. That's when I noticed a narrow, winding dirt road through the trees. It wasn't on my map, but it looked like a shortcut that might lead me back to the right trail. I decided to follow it, hoping it would intersect with the path I was meant to be on. The road was rough and overgrown with weeds, clearly unused for years. I kept walking, determined to find my way. The forest around me was thick, and the tree canopy blocked much of the remaining light. Then, I heard faint sounds of laughter and conversation. I was relieved to hear human voices. I quickened my pace, rounding the bend. I stumbled upon a clearing. There was a run-down cabin, smoke slowly rising from the chimney. A group of people, men and women, stood around a fire, the flames casting flickering shadows over their bodies. They turned to look at me as I emerged from the trees. Their expressions were a mix of curiosity and amusement. A large man with a thick beard spoke first, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "Looks like you took a wrong turn somewhere," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Come have a drink," another man said, lifting a bottle. He was younger, maybe in his late 20s, with a sly smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I hesitated, but the lure of company and the warmth of the fire was too tempting to resist. I walked over and dropped my pack by a tree stump. "I'm Carter," I introduced myself. "Nice to meet you all." "You're Carter. I'm Zeke," said the large man, patting my shoulder with a hand that felt like a sledgehammer. He nodded toward the younger man. "This is my brother Tom," and then motioned to the others. "Our friends, Caleb, Beth, and Mary." The two women, Beth and Mary, smiled at me. Smiles that seemed a little too wide. Something about their eyes made me uncomfortable, but I brushed it off, telling myself they were probably just friendly country folk. We chatted for a while, sharing stories and laughs. They offered me food and drink. I wasn't particularly hungry, but out of politeness I accepted. As the night wore on, a strange sense of unease crept in. Their laughter grew louder, more frequent, and their eyes gleamed in the firelight. "So what brought you out here?" Caleb asked me, his scarred face lit eerily by the fire. I responded, my mind racing. "You picked a great place for that," Zeke said, his tone shifting slightly. "Yeah, these woods can be tricky," Tom added with a knowing smile. At that moment, alarm bells went off in my head. I looked around suddenly, realizing just how isolated we were. The cabin, the fire, the group. Everything felt too deliberate. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I didn't want to seem rude or suspicious. "Well, I guess I should start heading back to the trail before it gets too dark," I said, standing up and reaching for my pack. "Nonsense," Zeke barked, stepping in front of me. "You're staying the night. Plenty of room in the cabin." "No, really, I should." I began, but Zeke cut me off with a growl, tightening his grip on my arm. That's when I realized I wasn't just dealing with friendly locals anymore. These people had a different agenda, and I was right in the middle of it. I tried to pull away, but Caleb and Tom were on me in an instant, their rough hands gripping me firmly. "Let's not make this difficult," Caleb hissed, his breath hot on my face. Panic surged through me as I struggled against them, while Beth and Mary watched with cold indifference. The friendly facade was gone, replaced by a chilling amusement. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You'll find out soon enough," Zeke replied with a wicked grin spreading across his face. They dragged me into the cabin and shut the door behind us. The air inside was thick with the stench of rot and something else I couldn't identify. They shoved me into a chair and tied me down with practiced ease. "We like to have guests for dinner," Tom said, his voice dripping with malice. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. These weren't just unfriendly locals. They were something much worse. My heart pounded as I fought against the ropes. My options were limited. The ropes cut into my skin, and every movement sent waves of pain through my body. As the night wore on, a sense of hopelessness began to settle in. Then, suddenly, I heard rustling outside. It was followed by faint voices. "Someone's coming," Zeke barked, narrowing his eyes in suspicion. He and the others scrambled to hide their tools and weapons, their demeanor shifting from menacing to cautious. The door creaked open, and a group of hikers stood there, their eyes wide with shock as they took in the scene. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Nothing for you to worry about," Zeke said, trying to block their view of me, but it was too late. The hikers saw that I was tied up and beaten. Their expressions shifted from confusion to anger. "Untie him now," one of the hikers shouted as he stepped forward. Zeke hesitated, his eyes darting between the hikers and his family. He knew he was outnumbered, and with a frustrated snarl, motioned for Caleb and Tom to release me. They helped me to my feet, gently but firmly, and led me out of the cabin. As we made our way back to the main trail, I glanced back one last time. The family stood in the doorway, their eyes filled with hatred and defeat. The hikers didn't ask many questions, and I didn't offer many answers. We walked in silence, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy in the air. When we finally reached the trailhead, they called the authorities to make sure the family was dealt with. I thanked the hikers, my voice hoarse with exhaustion. They nodded kindly, but they were clearly shaken as well. That night taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Nature might be a peaceful refuge, but sometimes it hides the darkest of secrets. My name is James Wilson, and this is the story of how a weekend I expected to be fun turned into a battle for survival. The story began when my friend Michael and our friend Sarah invited me to join them on a camping trip to a remote area in the forests of northern Maine. Michael had discovered a perfect camping spot online, far away from the noise and usual tourist spots. He loaded the car with all the camping gear, snacks, and a cooler full of drinks, and our spirits were high as we were excited for the upcoming adventure. Our journey started off wonderfully. We laughed, sang along to our favorite songs, and joked about the horrors we might face in the woods. As we drove along, the paved road began to fade into gravel and then dirt. This didn't worry us, as Michael seemed confident in his navigation skills. But after a while, things took a different turn. The road grew narrower, and the trees surrounded us on both sides. When we reached a dead end, we realized we had gotten lost. Michael examined his phone, only to find that the signal had disappeared entirely, rendering the GPS useless. He muttered as he looked at the map. "This doesn't look right." Sarah suggested that we turn back and try to find the main road, but the main road seemed increasingly out of reach. We wandered for hours, and the sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows as we continued driving down a narrow path in the dense forest. Finally, Michael suggested we set up camp in a small clearing, hoping to find our way in the morning. We quickly pitched our tents, but the atmosphere felt strange. The forest was unnaturally quiet. There were no sounds of crickets or rustling leaves. A chill crept down my spine, but I tried to dismiss it. We lit a fire in an attempt to lift our spirits and sat around it, talking and trying to ease the tension. Michael opened a few drinks and said, "We got lost and found ourselves on a real adventure." We laughed a little, but I sensed the tension in the air, as if the forest were watching us. Then suddenly we heard rustling in the bushes. We froze, listening intently. Michael said quietly, "Maybe it's just a deer," but his voice lacked confidence. Sarah looked around anxiously and suggested, "Maybe we should just sleep in the car tonight." Before we could decide, a man appeared from the trees. His clothes were torn, and his hair was unkempt. He looked as if he hadn't eaten in days. He stumbled toward us, his eyes frantic and his body trembling. He shouted, "They're coming!" Michael quickly stood up and asked, "Who's coming?" But the man couldn't answer clearly. He collapsed beside the fire and whispered in a shaky voice, "You have to run. They will find you." Panic began to seep into our minds as we exchanged worried glances. Sarah took a step back, trembling, but Michael tried to reassure her. Before we could comprehend the situation, we heard another rustling in the bushes, and this time there was not just one man. A group of people emerged from the trees. They looked bizarre, with tattered clothes and hungry, wild eyes fixed on us. Michael grabbed a branch from the fire and raised it as a weapon, yelling at them, "Back off." But they didn't retreat. They moved toward us slowly, like predators closing in on their prey. Suddenly, one of them lunged at Michael, who swung the branch and knocked him to the ground, but others rushed in. Sarah screamed and tried to run, but one of the attackers grabbed her from behind. I felt an overwhelming urge to protect her, so I charged at them and pushed him away. We managed to flee and ran toward the car. We sprinted as fast as we could while Michael was still fighting them. Once we reached the car, we jumped inside and slammed the doors shut. Michael was still outside, struggling against them. I screamed at him to get in, but he was cornered. Suddenly, he swung the branch violently in a last-ditch effort to defend himself and managed to escape to the car just before more attackers closed in. He climbed in quickly and slammed the door, shouting, "Go! Go!" I slammed my foot on the gas, and the car surged forward, leaving those figures behind in the darkness. My heart was pounding fiercely, and I had no idea where we were going. The forest seemed endless. We drove all night, constantly glancing in the rearview mirror, fearful of seeing them again. At dawn, we stumbled upon a rundown gas station. It felt like a blessing from heaven, but at the same time, it resembled a trap. The place was abandoned, the windows boarded up, but one pump was still operational. As I filled the tank, I noticed a small girl standing at the edge of the forest. She was dirty, with torn clothes, and her eyes were filled with fear. "Are you okay?" I asked cautiously. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "They took my brother," she whispered. Sarah looked at her sadly and said, "We can't leave her here." But Michael hesitated. "If we go back into the woods, we might not make it out again." But I couldn't leave the girl alone. I said, "We have to try. We can't leave her brother behind." Michael reluctantly agreed, and we followed the girl's directions back into the woods. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every rustle a potential attacker. We soon reached a clearing where the girl said her brother was held captive. It was an old, abandoned cabin, its windows dark and menacing. We approached cautiously, weapons ready. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floorboards creaked under our weight as we moved through the downstairs rooms. We found him tied up, barely conscious but alive. "We're here to help," I whispered as I cut his bindings. His eyes fluttered open slowly, and he managed a weak smile. But our relief was short-lived when we heard the door open upstairs and the attackers burst in. We fought desperately, but they showed no mercy. The girl's brother was too weak to walk, and we had to drag him through the chaos we had entered. The car was colliding with the attackers who were surrounding us, forcing us to slam the gas pedal down and continue down the road as they disappeared into the distance. The journey back to civilization was a blur. We were exhausted, covered in blood and dirt, but we had survived. We reached a small town and stumbled into the sheriff's office, breathlessly recounting our story. At first, the authorities didn't believe us, but when they saw our condition and the evidence we had, they launched an investigation. The attackers were real, and their hideout was found with the remains of their previous victims. In the end, we survived, but the experience changed us. We faced something unimaginable and made it out alive, reuniting the girl with her brother and their family, while we returned to our lives forever, carrying the horrors we faced. There's no dramatic ending here, just a return to normal life forever changed, but on the surface, life goes on as it is. Yet somewhere deep in the forests of Maine, shadows still hide secrets, and the memories of that night linger in our minds. The highway stretched before me like an endless black ribbon cutting through the dense forest of northern Minnesota. I had always prided myself on my sense of direction, but on that particular day, I felt utterly lost. I had set out early that morning from Duluth, intending to visit an old college friend named Jim in a small town called Ely. Unfortunately, I took a wrong turn while navigating the Vermilion Forest, putting me on an unknown path. My name is Mark Turner, and I have a habit of taking scenic routes, but this time, that habit led me astray. As the afternoon approached, the sun began to set, casting long shadows that made the forest appear even more foreboding. I glanced at my fuel gauge, and it was nearly empty. I needed to find a place to stop, check my directions, and refuel. That's when I spotted a narrow dirt road leading off the main highway. A hand-painted sign read, "Bratton's Gas Station 5 miles." When I arrived at Bratton's, I felt as if I had stepped into a different era. The station was old-fashioned, with a vintage pump standing in front of a dilapidated building and a rusty pickup truck parked nearby. The place seemed deserted, but I had no other options. As I parked, a tall, thin man emerged from the shadows, wearing a greasy work uniform and sporting a scruffy beard. His eyes were wary but not unfriendly. "Do you need gas?" he asked in a gravelly voice. I replied with a yes and stepped out of my car to explain that I was trying to reach Ely. He nodded and began to pump gas, saying, "You've strayed a bit off course. Ely is about 60 miles west from here. Looks like you took a wrong turn back at Vermilion." My heart sank at the thought. "Can you point me to the main road?" I asked. He laughed deep in his throat. "Sure, but it's getting dark, and it's dangerous to drive these roads at night. There's a hotel about 10 miles from here. I recommend you stay there and head out fresh in the morning." I considered his advice and decided to take it. Driving unfamiliar roads in the dark didn't seem wise. I thanked him for his help. Once he finished pumping gas, he handed me the bill. As I paid, a heavy-set woman emerged from the building, carrying a tray piled with what looked like homemade bacon. "Would you like some?" she asked, pushing the tray toward me. I was about to decline when I noticed her gaze fixated on something behind me. I turned to see two other figures emerging from behind the gas station. A massive man with a scarred face and a teenage girl who looked eerily calm. The girl said in a soft voice, "We don't get many visitors here." That struck me as odd. "You should stay for dinner," she added. Alarm bells began to ring in my head. There was something unsettling about this place and its inhabitants. I smiled weakly. Thanks, but I really need to get back on the road. But the tall man grasped my arm, not tightly, but firmly enough to convey a message. No need to rush, he said. I looked around, searching for an escape route, but the forest loomed ominously on all sides, and the dirt road I had come from seemed to stretch on forever. I felt cornered. It seems like a nice dinner, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The tall man smiled slyly as I noticed the smell of cooking meat mixed with something foul. The furniture was old and rickety, reminiscent of a thrift store. They led me to a table and sat me down. The woman brought plates piled with food, meats, potatoes, and some kind of thick soup. The family sat around the table, watching me intently. I took a bite of the meat and chewed slowly. It tasted strange, unlike any meat I had eaten before, and my stomach began to churn. I forced myself not to gag. The girl smiled at me, her sharp teeth glinting. I nodded, unsure of what to say. The atmosphere in the room was stifling. I needed to get out of there, but how? The massive man sat closest to the door, while the others blocked any other exit. "Excuse me," I said, standing up. "I need to use the bathroom." The tall man pointed to a narrow hallway leading to a door on the right. I walked down the hall, my heart racing. As soon as I was out of their sight, I began to search for an escape. The windows were barred and the doors were locked. I opened the bathroom door and slipped inside, shutting it behind me. There was a small window above the sink, large enough for me to squeeze through. I climbed onto the sink, opened the window, and pulled myself up as I slipped out. I heard footsteps approaching. I had to hurry. I fell to the ground outside and ran toward the forest. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere was better than that terrifying house. I scratched my face and hands on the branches as I ran, but I didn't stop. I heard shouting behind me. The family was chasing me. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. The forest was a maze, and I had no idea which way to go after what felt like hours. I saw a light ahead. I ran toward it, hoping it would lead to a road or another house. It was an open area with a small cabin in the center. I knocked on the door, praying someone was home. An elderly man opened the door, his eyes widening in surprise. "What's going on, son?" he asked. "Please help me. There are people chasing me." He let me inside and closed the door behind me. "Sit down and catch your breath," he said. I sank into a rickety chair, trying to calm my racing heart. "Thank you. I don't know who they are, but they're dangerous," the old man nodded. "You're safe here. This is my hunting cabin. There are plenty of guns and ammunition." He handed me a cup of water, and I drank it gratefully. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done if you weren't here." He patted my shoulder. "You'll be fine. Just stay put. They won't find you here." I hoped he was right. Minutes passed, and the adrenaline began to drain from my body. I was exhausted, but I couldn't let my guard down. I needed to stay alert. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, and the door swung open. The massive man from the gas station stood there, a crazed look in his eyes. "I found you," he bellowed. The old man grabbed a rifle from the wall and fired a warning shot. "Get out of here, or the next one will go through your skull." The massive man hesitated, but then retreated. But the danger wasn't over. He roared before disappearing into the night. The old man shut the door firmly. A moment later, he opened the door again and turned to me. "You need to leave. They'll come back with more men." I nodded, my hands shaking. "Thank you for everything. I'll never forget this." He handed me a flashlight and pointed to a path. "Follow this trail. It will lead you to the highway." "Stay safe, son." I nodded again and set off into the night, my heart heavy with fear and gratitude. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, where the first rays of dawn broke on the horizon. I flagged down a passing car and collapsed into the passenger seat. My ordeal was finally over. I never found out what happened to that family or why they targeted me, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never forget that night in the Minnesota woods. I thought I knew the way, but I had just taken a wrong turn off Route 61. I could blame the old GPS or maybe my own foolishness. But now I was stuck on a narrow, winding road in the middle of nowhere. My name is Quentin Raid, and I've always had a knack for finding trouble, but this time it felt different. I gazed at the landscape around me. Dense, abandoned forests on either side of the road. The trees intertwined in such a way that sunlight struggled to penetrate. I imagined I would soon find an open area or a side road, but as fate would have it, the road grew narrower and more rugged. Finally, my eyes fell on an old rusty sign that read Blackwood, and despite my better judgment advising me to turn back, I continued on. The road led me deep into the woods, where the trees crowded in as if trying to swallow my car. Just as I began to doubt my decision, the trees parted, revealing a small clearing with a dilapidated gas station and a rundown diner. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades, but there were a few cars parked in front. I thought about stopping to ask for directions, and maybe grab a cup of coffee to clear my mind. I parked my car and got out, gravel crunching beneath my feet. The only sound in that eerie silence was the air saturated with the scent of pine and decay. I pushed the door to the diner, and a small bell jingled overhead. The inside was as tattered as the outside, with peeling wallpaper and flickering neon lights. There were a few customers who looked like they hadn't seen the outside world in a long time. Behind the counter stood a large man with a gray beard and a stained apron, eyeing me with suspicion. I approached him, feeling lost, and he asked in a gruff voice. "Yes," I answered, trying to sound confident. I was trying to get back to Route 61. He smirked and said, "Your GPS doesn't work here. You might as well put it aside." I nodded, feeling uneasy. "Is there another way back to the highway?" He wiped his hands on his apron and gestured out the window. "Keep going down this road. You'll reach a fork. Take the left path and it will lead you to the main road." I thanked him, but something in his tone made me doubt his directions. I ordered a coffee while I thought. I needed a break before I plunged back into the maze of trees. While I waited, I felt something unsettling. All the customers were staring at me, their eyes following my every move. An elderly woman in the corner whispered to her companion while he shook his head, looking at me with a mix of pity and fear. I took my coffee and decided to return to the road as I was leaving. The large man called out behind me, "Stay on the road and don't stray." His words echoed in my mind. I returned to my car and passed by the gas station. The road twisted and turned through the woods, as if the trees were closing in on me, with branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. After hours, I came to a fork, with the left path leading to the main road, but I couldn't remember where I had taken the left. I soon realized I was still lost. The road was rough and overgrown, as if it were twisting around itself. Panic began to seep into my body as darkness fell. Just when I thought I would be driving in circles forever, I saw someone standing in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes, my heart racing. It was a woman, her clothes torn and dirty, her eyes wide open with fear. I ran to my window and banged on the glass. "Please help me," I shouted. I rolled down the window and asked, "What happened?" She replied urgently, "They're coming. They'll kill us both. If we don't get out of here, I won't need to be told twice." I opened the door and she got in carrying a tattered backpack. I pressed the gas pedal hard, the tires spinning on the gravel before they found traction as we sped down the road she had come from. I looked over her shoulder. Her breath was ragged, and I asked, "The Blackwood family, where are they?" She said, trembling, "Cannibals. They hunt anyone who gets lost in these woods." A chill ran down my spine. "How do we get out?" I asked her. She shook her head. "There is no exit. They control these woods, but there's a cabin up ahead. We can hide there." We traveled in silence. The only sound was the roar of the engine and the crunch of gravel. True to her word, we found the cabin, a dilapidated structure hidden among the trees. We left the car and ran inside, closing the door behind us. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb. "We can't stay here," I said. "They'll find us." She nodded. "But we need to rest. We'll move at first light." We huddled in a corner, listening to the sounds of the woods, every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves making my heart race. Hours passed, but sleep was impossible as dawn approached. We heard footsteps outside, heavy, deliberate steps. She whispered, pale-faced, "They've arrived." We crept to the window and took a look. A group of men stood outside, their faces twisted in a strange semblance of humanity. The leader, a massive man with unkempt hair and a blood-stained shirt, shouted, "Come out, and we'll make it quick." I looked at the woman. "Do you trust me?" I asked. She nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "Follow me," I said as I grabbed a rusty pipe from the corner. We slipped out the back door, moving as silently as we could. The forest was a maze, but the woman seemed to know the way. The sounds of the pursuit faded with every step. Just when I thought we might have escaped, we stumbled into a clearing, and the scene that greeted us was gruesome. Blood was pooling, cold bodies, or what was left of them, hanging from the trees like grotesque decorations, bones and pieces of flesh scattered on the ground. The smell of death was overwhelming, and I said, "We need to keep moving." We wandered around the clearing, our eyes scanning the woods for any sign of movement. When we reached the far side, a branch snapped behind us. We turned to see the leader of the cannibals, his eyes burning with rage. "You can't escape," he roared as he lunged at us. I swung the pipe with all my might, hitting him on the side of the head. He staggered, blood streaming down his face, but he didn't fall. He lunged at me with hands like iron claws, and we struggled as the world faded away between us. I heard the woman scream, but her voice seemed distant and unimportant amid my desperate effort. I managed to bring the pipe down on his head again, and this time he collapsed to the ground, his body twitching. Before I could calm down, I staggered back, gasping for air with trembling hands. "We have to go," the woman said, pulling me to my feet. We ran through the woods as the sun rose higher in the sky. Finally, we managed to break through the trees and reach a main road. I had never been so happy to see asphalt in my life. We flagged down a passing car, and a kind old man agreed to take us to the nearest town. "Do you trust me?" I asked. She nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "Follow me," I said as I grabbed a rusty pipe from the corner. We slipped out the back door, moving as silently as we could. The forest was a maze, but the woman seemed to know the way. The sounds of the pursuit faded with every step. Just when I thought we might have escaped, we stumbled into a clearing, and the scene that greeted us was gruesome. Blood was pooling, cold bodies, or what was left of them, hanging from the trees like grotesque decorations, bones and pieces of flesh scattered on the ground. The smell of death was overwhelming, and I said, "We need to keep moving." We wandered around the clearing, our eyes scanning the woods for any sign of movement. When we reached the far side, a branch snapped behind us. We turned to see the leader of the cannibals, his eyes burning with rage. "You can't escape," he roared as he lunged at us. I swung the pipe with all my might, hitting him on the side of the head. He staggered, blood streaming down his face, but he didn't fall. He lunged at me with hands like iron claws, and we struggled as the world faded away between us. I heard the woman scream, but her voice seemed distant and unimportant amid my desperate effort. I managed to bring the pipe down on his head again, and this time he collapsed to the ground, his body twitching. Before I could calm down, I staggered back, gasping for air with trembling hands. "We have to go," the woman said, pulling me to my feet. We ran through the woods as the sun rose higher in the sky. Finally, we managed to break through the trees and reach a main road. I had never been so happy to see asphalt in my life. We flagged down a passing car, and a kind old man agreed to take us to the nearest town. "This is my wife, Clara," he said. "I'll get you something to eat." As Clara went away, the smell of something cooking hit me as soon as we entered the kitchen. I sat at the table, feeling Clara's eyes watching me with a strange intensity. She brought me a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. The experience was terrifying. As I took a bite, I felt something strange coursing through my body. While I was eating, a sharp pain began in my stomach. I tried to resist, but the pain grew worse. At that moment, Clara smiled a twisted smile and said, "Welcome to the end of Hollows." I woke up in a dark room, my hands and feet bound. My heart raced as I remembered what had happened. I heard the creak of the door, and the man entered with a rusty knife. He cut the ropes binding me and pulled me out of the room. He led me to a dark cellar, where I stumbled onto the cold ground. As I regained my senses, I saw piles of bones, some still attached to bits of flesh. Panic surged within me, but I had to stay calm. In that moment, I spotted someone else in the corner. I helped the other person free themselves from their restraints, and we began searching for a way out. After a long struggle, we discovered a small door leading to a narrow tunnel. We slipped through it, gasping for breath in the damp air. After hours of crawling, we finally emerged into the forest. The air was fresh, but we couldn't stop. We were running through the woods, our feet tripping over branches. Eventually, we spotted a police car parked by the roadside. I waved my arms and shouted for help. As the officer approached, he looked at us in shock. I tried to explain what had happened. His expression turned serious as he realized the danger we were in. We climbed into the car while the officer called for backup, and we sped away from that dark place. I glanced back at the forest, the trees closing in as if pulling me back into my nightmare. But I realized we had escaped,